is an associate professor of pediatrics at Wayne State University School of Medicine. She is a medical director at Kids Talk Children's Advocacy Center in Detroit, where she performs medical evaluations for children suspected of being maltreated and victims of human trafficking. Dr. Nazer is certified by the American Board of Pediatrics in both general pediatrics and child abuse pediatrics. Dr. Nazer was appointed by Governor Gretchen as a member of the Michigan Human Trafficking Health Advisory Board and is serving her second term. She actively teaches healthcare professionals nationally and internationally on the topic of child maltreatment and human trafficking. Dr. Nazer, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be with you. And I'm actually honored that you're willing to spend your Saturday afternoon listening to me talk about human trafficking. I'll go ahead and start sharing my slides. Okay. So when I talk about human trafficking, and this is a smaller group in terms of numbers, so we can always ask and answer questions and maybe put things in the chat as we go. But really the target of talking about human trafficking and the main objective is how can we all work together as partners of excellence for better identification and prevention. So the main objectives that I will cover over the next hour are to really talk about the warning signs of human trafficking. So what do we see and what warns us that there probably is a victim of human trafficking? How do we identify the victims? So if I see someone that I'm concerned about, how would I say that this is probably a victim of human trafficking? And the way that we're going to do this is by two ways. We're going to be dispelling some myths. There are a lot of myths when it comes to human trafficking. And then we will learn together, but more importantly, we will unlearn and then we will relearn some concepts that we've just kind of, held all the time, but then some of these concepts are not very true. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is to work together as partners of excellence for better identification and prevention. So when I show you the slide, I'll be talking about a myth. So I'll show you what the myth is, and then I'll also tell you what the reality is. So we will dispel the myth together. And then when I show you the slide that has kind of like the three brains in the photo, it will tell you that this is the time where we need to learn together. We need to unlearn certain concepts, and we also need to relearn certain things together as well. The way that we're also going to be talking about human trafficking is that I'm going to show you different examples. So if you think about this, and if you think about yourself in the world, and if you think about everybody around you, it's almost like we're little pieces of puzzles. So as I talk to you about human trafficking, I will be telling you about 4 different pieces of the puzzles. So I'll tell you about the blue piece of the puzzle, the green piece of the puzzle, the yellow piece, and the red piece, and I'll tell you each one of their stories. So green is referred to as green because green is the green piece of the puzzle. Safra is actually the word yellow in Arabic. So safra is the yellow piece of the puzzle. Azul is the blue piece of the puzzle. So azul is blue in Spanish. And then rouge is the color red in French. So rouge is the red piece of the puzzle. And this is just to kind of show you a little bit more diversity where you're thinking about children and you're thinking about adults and you're thinking about victims of human trafficking, but you're also thinking about yourself as how you are connected to them. So these pieces of the puzzle, they don't just fall alone. They're not alone there in the world. They are connected to other people, including yourself. And ultimately, again and again, I want to stress out the point that we want to work together as partners of excellence for better identification and prevention. So what is human trafficking? When we talk about human trafficking, I think the most important thing is the definition. So one of the most important definitions of human trafficking is that it's a violation of human rights. So when you think about human trafficking, it's a public health crisis. It is a crime based on exploitation. So it's one person exploiting another person for sex, for labor, for both. And then all trafficking victims share one essential component, which is really the loss of freedom. And as we think about human trafficking, there's something that we need to learn and unlearn. Remember this photo of the three brains together where we kind of unlearn something together. So this is something that I even used to refer to during my previous talks, and it's still something that's also used by a lot of different lectures and a lot of different topics. So the language is very, very important. And as we talk about human trafficking, what we refer to in terms of human trafficking and the victims and the language and the words that we use are very, very, very important. So we always used to refer to human trafficking as modern day slavery. Now we're trying to stay away from using that word because it really minimizes the historical enslavement of African people and the multi-generational trauma and resulting impact. It can also be harmful to survivors because when I say modern day slavery, in your mind, you're thinking of slavery and you're thinking of how do I modernize this concept and what exactly is going on? So it's actually harmful to survivors as well because it paints this inaccurate picture. So that's why in this talk, one of the most important things that we're going to get out of it is that we really need to approach language with intentionality in order to help individuals and communities more intimately understand the issues of human trafficking, who's impacted by it, and how you are responsible to move towards action. Another myth that comes also in the world of human trafficking is that everybody feels that sex trafficking is the only form of human trafficking and it only affects women. Probably blame the media because I feel that any case of sex trafficking gets a lot of media attention. Labor trafficking gets almost none. And it seems that when women are involved or girls are involved, that it gets a lot of media attention. However, in reality, the federal definition of human trafficking, it encompasses both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and the crime can affect men, women, children, and adults. So this is the huge federal definition of human trafficking. This is kind of the umbrella term. So when we think of human trafficking, we're thinking about this huge umbrella term that encompasses sex trafficking, and it also has labor trafficking at the same time. So sex trafficking is the commercial sexual act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person performing the act is less than age 18. So remember this because I do talk very, very fast, and I've been told that I speak faster when I become a little bit more passionate about what I'm talking about. But I will repeat the concepts over and over again. So don't worry, if you miss a concept, I will go over it again. But when it comes to sex trafficking, if the person who's performing the sexual act is even one day younger than their 18th birthday, then that is considered human trafficking. A child or someone who's less than age 18 cannot consent to any commercial sexual act. Labor trafficking, on the other hand, is force, fraud, or coercion, but it's really to recruit, harbor, transport, obtain a person for labor or services. So another myth that also is related to human trafficking is that everybody feels that because it has the word trafficking, so you think of yourself through traffic, stuck in traffic, a lot of traffic, you kind of think that there has to be some sort of travel or some sort of movement across state or national borders. This is a myth. We get a lot of victims of human trafficking that haven't even left their home. So victims can be trafficked in their own household, in their own city, at their own schools. They don't need to leave. They don't need to go across the borders for that to happen. So in reality, trafficking does not require transportation. It could be used to control the victims, but transportation is not required for us to say that this is human trafficking. And this is where smuggling comes into place. So smuggling is transportation-based, trafficking is exploitation-based. So let's say that I take one person or a person and I take them across the US-Mexican border and I take them illegally, then that's considered smuggling because I took that person and I transported them from one point to the other. However, if I don't request or I don't require anything from that person, then that is just merely smuggling. However, if the transporter comes along and says, well, now I've transported you and now you owe me and you need to work for me because I transported you or I smuggled you from point A to point B, then that becomes trafficking. So remember, trafficking is exploitation-based and smuggling is transportation-based. This is just kind of an overview to remind you that usually there's an act, which is recruiting, transferring, transporting, harboring, and it's done by force, fraud, or coercion. And it's done for exploitation for sexual or labor or for both or for other forms of exploitation as well. So these are pretty much the elements of human trafficking, which is the act, the means, and then the purpose or the exploitation. However, remember, over and over again, if you have a child who is less than age 18, you can show that they are a victim of human trafficking without showing any force, fraud, or coercion. So when we identify that a child is a victim of human trafficking, or anyone who's under age 18 is a victim of child sexual exploitation, we don't need to show that this child was forced. We don't need to show that this child was tricked or coerced into doing any of those because they are a child. So force is the use of physical restraints. And we've seen it in a lot of our victims where they are held captive. Sometimes that involves beatings, kicking, physical confinement. It's really a means to control the victim. So force is really what it says it is. It's the use of force to control the person. Fraud is false promises. So for example, we had a victim who was promised that she would be doing some modeling, that she would be kind of presenting and her photos would be taken. And then she was taken to a hotel room and she was raped by several different individuals. So this is where fraud or false promises were involved. Coercion is when there are threats or serious harms or physical restraint against any person. So someone is kind of threatening or coercing the child or coercing the adult to do things because otherwise they would harm their family. Otherwise, they might burn their house down. They might do the same to their sister. So coercion is something that's also used for control, and it's one of the acts that is used in trafficking. So let's talk about another myth. So another myth is that because this act is done for exploitation and because someone is exploiting another person for sex or for labor, and then they're giving them probably money or they're giving them shelter or something else, then maybe the victims of human trafficking always come from poverty or always come from rural villages, because why else would they do something like that? But this is not true. Because the victims that we see, especially at our clinic, we see that they come from a range of income levels. And we have had children of families with higher socioeconomic statuses. So chances are it's happening nearby. And chances are you've probably encountered a victim or seen a business that has trafficking kind of as part of it as well. So victims are most often trafficked by someone that they know. Pretty much the same as child sexual abuse. It usually happens by someone who is known to the family or someone who's known to that individual, someone at school, a romantic partner, someone who's a family member, someone that they know of. And it's really market driven. So unfortunately, it exists because there's always a demand for cheap labor. Everybody wants something that's cheaper, and there is a demand for commercial sex. And there's also a supply. So there are vulnerable children and adults. And because they're present and because they can do these things in lieu of money or shelter, then that's how this exists, and exists as a pretty much a business that has high profits and low risk for people. So just to summarize a little bit, victims of human trafficking could be domestic or international. They could be victims of sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or both. Victims may be male or female. And victims may be adults or children. So really anyone can be a victim. This is one of the first stories that I start with, and this is Shema Hall. So she talks about herself and she names herself the slave in the garage. So remember, we talked about the word slavery, but actually if the victim or the person or the child or the adult is referring to themselves using these words, then out of respect, I do respect their terminology. So what happened in this case is that Shema, she was living in Egypt, and her older sister was working at a well-to-do family's home, where her older sister breaks something that's worth $30. So then that family comes to Shema's family and says, your daughter broke something, it's worth $30. How are you going to pay? Well, they don't have any money to pay. So what they do is that they sell Shema, or they give Shema to that family instead of $30. And then she works at that family's home. And then that family decides to go from Egypt to the US. So then they smuggled Shema across the border. So this is where smuggling is transportation based. They smuggled her from Egypt to the US. One of them pretended to be her father, and then she was trafficked for 2 years. She was finally freed in 2002 when Child Services received an anonymous tip about her. So remember that one call to Child Protective Services can save a child's life. So if you think about Shema, this is where she lived for 2 years. She was trafficked for 2 years for labor. She was not even allowed to wash her clothes with the rest of the family. She was supposed to be working day in and day out. She was hid away from the public eye and just kind of staying here in this garage for 2 years. So that's why she refers to herself as the slave in the garage. These are the traffickers. So these are This is the couple that transported her or smuggled her from Egypt to the US and then trafficked her for 2 years. And I put their photo to show you that they could have been anyone. They could have been your neighbor, they could have been your friends or your coworkers. Traffickers don't have a specific way that they look. They may look like anyone. So just to remember from the story and from Shayma's kind of relay of events and how they happened, we kind of remember the definition of the word smuggling. We remember that trafficking usually occurs by someone who's known to the family. And in this particular case, it was really her parents, and it was a family who was known to the parents. And then she was trafficked for labor. And then she was also rescued by that one phone call to Child Protective Services. So when we talk about that example, and this is kind of an example from Egypt to the US, she was actually in California. So does human trafficking happen in Michigan? So I pulled up the most recent numbers related to Michigan. So I'll start off with the national numbers first. So 50,000, actually over 50,000 signals were received by the hotline in 2021. So just in 1 year, this is the number of phone calls that the National Human Trafficking Hotline received regarding cases of suspected human trafficking. And this is an amazing, amazing website, because what you can do is that you can put your state, or you can even search by zip code. You can search by a lot of different things to kind of find out in your state what is going on in terms of human trafficking. So I searched for you in terms of Michigan. And then in Michigan, since 2007, look at the number of hotline calls. There are over 7,000 calls. Look at the number of online reports, the number of text messages, the number of emails, the number of web chats. So since its inception, the Human Trafficking Hotline has identified almost 2,500 cases of human trafficking, and over 5,000 victims were identified in these cases. Also in Michigan, if you look at the numbers from 2012 all the way up to 2019, you'll notice that the number of calls has gone up. The number of cases has also gone up in terms of identifying victims of human trafficking. Also in Michigan, this is the last year that we have statistics for, so we don't have any yet for 2022. So the last statistics, and I really tried pulling them up this morning just in the hopes that I'll have something from 2022. This is the number of signals, and then the number of signals were of victims or survivors, so you have over 500 individuals. And how do contacts hear about the hotline? So how do people know that there's a hotline that exists for human trafficking? It's either by referral, it's by training, it's by internet. And then this just kind of shows you the different numbers. And I'm not trying to have you memorize these numbers, but it's just kind of a nice way to know that you can go to this website and search for any numbers that might be of interest to you. The most type of trafficking that was reported in the state of Michigan was for sex trafficking. And I think it's just because we're a little bit more aware of sex trafficking and related to labor trafficking. But look at the third kind of bar there where it says sex and labor. So some individuals were actually trafficked for both sex and labor as well. The venues for sex trafficking are variable. Sometimes it happens at different motels, hotels. Sometimes it's residence-based. So we've had mothers traffic their own children, their own daughters, because they wanted to pay the rent, or they wanted to buy drugs, or they wanted to get money to buy food. So this is a serious, serious problem. We're having a lot of child pornography lately. I think it's just been a lot easier for children to take their own photos, for parents to take photos of their kids, for exploiters to exploit these photos. So we're seeing kind of an increase in that. We also have sex trafficking at massage and spa businesses, and pretty much like, online ads. And then if you think of labor trafficking, it's domestic work, and it's anything that's related to the area that you live in. So whether it's, for example, traveling, restaurant, food, retail, agriculture, these are all kind of the different numbers that happen in Michigan. So I'm just trying to convince you that it does happen here in Michigan, and the numbers are just the tip of the iceberg, because I'm pretty sure that we underreport a lot of these numbers. So let's talk about another myth as it relates to human trafficking. So sometimes we think that it only occurs in illegal underground industries, that it's just kind of something that we don't know about, we don't see, it's just kind of like all illegal, it's all underground, people want to hide this crime. However, that's not true, because it actually occurs in legal, legitimate business settings, and sometimes businesses from overseas, or sometimes pretty much imported products that you buy might actually be kind of made by someone who was exploited, and you may never know about it. So I usually show this example from Michigan. So this is a restaurant in Novi, Michigan. The restaurant was a Chinese restaurant, and it was called Kim's Gardens. And if you heard the news in 2016, what happened is that on the news, they were talking about a fire that happened at the owner's house. So the restaurant owner's house was on fire. And then during that fire, there were five immigrants. I used to call them illegal immigrants, or I used to call them illegal residents, but then I realized that no one is illegal, and I just need to call them immigrants, or I need to call them, five individuals who were working, but they weren't really working. So they all perished in the fire, and they all died in that house. So what happened is that the owner of this restaurant, he had people working for him, or supposedly working for him, but he was actually trafficking them for labor. So he had them working for him at his restaurant, and then he had them living in his basement. And what happened is that 2 days before the fire, there was a cockroach problem going on in the house. So he leaves the house, he goes with his wife to his lake house, and he leaves these five people, five immigrants, he leaves them at his household. They were from Mexico. They did not know their address. They did not know where they lived. They did not even know how to call for help. And what's even worse than that, because for a moment I thought that he was nice to them and he had them working, but then the argument is that if he loved them like his own family, why didn't he even know their names? Why didn't he even pay the minimum wage? Why did he lie to the 911 operator when he called and he said that everyone was out safely when he knew that these five individuals were at his household? And I put their names so that we can all look at their names and we can all read them. And then from their names, you're going to realize that one of them is a child. So the first one, Bran, is 16. And then you'll notice that two of them were literally just 18. So he was exploiting them for labor, and he was labor trafficking them in his own household. So because of all of this going on, and because of the numbers in Michigan, that's when the state started putting a little bit more effort in addressing human trafficking. So that's why in 2014, Governor Snyder signed into bill a 21-bill legislative package. It included a lot of laws, including establishing the Human Trafficking Health Advisory Board. So I served with Governor Snyder for 3 years, and then now I'm serving with Governor Gretchen for 3 years as well on the Human Trafficking Health Advisory Board. And all we try to do as a health advisory board is to really offer trainings, offer education, work together, and try to develop some sort of system in the healthcare profession that talks about understanding human trafficking, understanding victims, identifying them a little bit more, and also identifying resources as well. So something that's very important as well for us to kind of unlearn and then relearn together is also related to the language. So this is from the Attorney General's website, and this is a trafficker. His name is Gruesome. And it's not me name calling him. I think I was giving this presentation one time and someone thought that I was the one who referred to him as Gruesome. This was actually his straight name. So he was referring to himself as that, but his real name is Cedric Mitchell. He was 32 years old. And then if you look at the little paragraph talking about him, it says that his street name was Gruesome, and then he was a pimp who preyed on young girls. And then he kept several girls in his house on Detroit's east side. He would engage them in prostitution, and then he would force them into the sex trade. He would rape his victims, and then he would also physically assault them, including choking a 15-year-old when she resisted him. Think about this example a little bit more, and think about language, and think about how your words matter. So that's why I crossed out the word pimp and I crossed out the word prostitution. So he was a trafficker. And then these children were not prostitutes. These children were victims of exploitation and victims of human trafficking. So what we also need to unlearn and relearn from this example is that sometimes when we read about these examples or when we hear about them on the news, sometimes there are all these gruesome details and graphic content of what happened to these survivors and what happened to these victims, which really doesn't positively impact them. So nobody needs to know, for example, how many times his victim was raped that one night. Nobody needs to know the gruesome details. You need to kind of focus more on the survivors versus what has happened to them. How did they survive? What has been their journey forward? And how can they share to help others do the same? So remember from Gruesome's example that gruesome details are not needed when we talk about victims or when we talk about survivors. The other thing that we will unlearn from this example is vocabulary. So if I tell you that this is a teen or this is a child prostitute, as was referred to in this example, when you read about it on the news or when you read about other examples, then you're trying to think of this child prostitute. You're trying to think that, this kind of implies choice. I think this child chose what she wanted to be or what he wanted to be. I think he's a bad kid. I think she's resistant. I think he's not worth the effort. I think she's a professional just kind of working and doing a job. I think they're just kind of juvenile offenders and criminals, and they pretty much deserve the consequences. They deserve the sexual violence. They deserve the social isolation and the incarceration. However, what we're going to do after today's presentation is that we're going to remove this from our vocabulary, and we're going to start thinking about this differently. So we'll start thinking about children as sexually exploited children. And when I say that word, then in your mind, you're kind of already painting a completely different picture. You're thinking of a young person who's been sexually used, coerced, manipulated, violently controlled for another person's profit. You're already thinking about a victim. You're thinking about inequality and power imbalance, about someone who's vulnerable. You're thinking about multiple systems of oppression, about a system of violence against women and children, and something inside you is moving to call for social responsibility and accountability. So that's why when we come to our objectives, all this language matters when we talk about children, when we talk about adults, and when we talk about victims and survivors of human trafficking. So going to kind of like another myth, and this is something that was pointed out to me by one of the attendees at one of my talks, and she said, you always have photos of different traffickers, but then realize that sometimes even when you Google the name, and even when you Google pimp or you Google the word trafficker, it always has kind of an image of this person that I have on the left. But in reality, they may look like anyone. And someone said, well, why don't you just even include Jeffrey Epstein in your presentation to kind of show people that, yes, traffickers may look differently. And this is why I have his photo, to show you that they may be anyone and everyone. And to show you that sometimes, this slide that I showed you on the left, especially when I give this talk around October, people have their children dressed as pimps or as traffickers. So remember that this is something that's real. This is something that is out there. And this is something that we need to respect when it comes to terminology and when it comes to stereotyping as well. And to think about this, in 2020, 42% of trafficking victims were brought into trafficking by a member of their own families, and 39% were recruited through some sort of marriage proposal or an intimate partner. So why do we focus on human trafficking in healthcare, other than the fact that I'm a pediatrician and I'm a child abuse pediatrician, and this is my specialty, this is what I do day in and day out? It's just kind of important. And it's important because when you think about healthcare and when you think about yourself and how you interact with other people in your community, you're on the front line to identify and intervene in cases of trafficking. So this is not just specific to healthcare people. This is specific to everyone. And that's why whether you're in the healthcare field or you're in the legal field or the criminal investigative field, or you're a school teacher, whether you're retired, whether you're working, it is important to you because most likely you have seen a victim and you have interacted with someone who's a victim. But then it comes to kind of the pieces of the puzzle. So how do we identify victims? I think we always spend a long period of time talking about victims and how we identify victims. And I want you to think about this differently. So I want you to think about this who's vulnerable. I want you to think about this in a different way. I don't want you spending all your time and all your energy thinking about who is a victim of human trafficking and how do I identify a victim. I want you to think who's vulnerable and who might be trafficked. So that's why I need to think about that person and I need to save that person before they become a victim of human trafficking. So we'll go back to our 4 examples of green, Safra, Azul, and Rouge. And we'll think about the individual. So we'll think about that one piece of the puzzle. However, if you look at that one piece of the puzzle, you'll see that that piece has all of this kind of little connections. So it's connected to something like on its right, on its left, on the top, on the bottom. It doesn't just kind of live alone in the world. This one piece of the puzzle has all these relationships around it. And if you think of these pieces together forming a relationship, you have to think of this whole community that's pretty much bound together like pieces of the puzzle are. And then you think of this whole society. So the community does not exist alone. There is a whole society of little puzzle pieces that are connected or disconnected, that they're all kind of together, living together in this society. So that's why when we think about someone who may be vulnerable or someone who might be trafficked, we think about what makes this person more vulnerable than the other. What makes this one piece of the puzzle more vulnerable or more likely to be trafficked than another piece of the puzzle? So we start thinking that maybe because, the young age, maybe because the younger people are, the younger children are, the more vulnerable they are. Maybe there's a history of abuse and neglect. Maybe there's a history of violence, running away from home, which is a big thing. Maybe they're part of a minority. Maybe there's substance misuse, forced migration, and limited education. But then we also start thinking about the relationship. What's going on in that family? Is there family violence? Is there family poverty? Is there family dysfunction? Is there forced migration going on in that family? And then we start thinking of the community. Are they pretty much tolerating sexual exploitation? Are we as a community lacking resources and support? And do we have a lot of violence? Do we have a high crime rate? What is going on in our community? And then what do we need to do as a society, which includes us kind of accepting and having gender-based violence and discrimination? What about our cultural attitudes, beliefs, and stigmas, and even the words that we use in the terminology? What about natural disasters and COVID? What about political and social upheaval? So that's why everything matters. And instead of thinking about who is a victim of human trafficking, let's think about who is at risk of being trafficked. So when we think about identifying victims of human trafficking, we'll go back to our little pieces of the puzzle, and then we'll start talking about Safra. So remember, the word Safra is yellow in Arabic. So Safra is the yellow piece of the puzzle. She's 19 years old, she's pregnant, and she needs assistance and resources. So whether you're a social worker, you're a teacher, you're a community member, you're a member of her church, you're there for therapy, you're there for support, you know her because she's a friend, you know her because she's a friend's daughter, she needs resources. But she was sent by her family to live with her cousin in Detroit and pursue her education because her family was going through financial trouble in Mexico. She doesn't speak English, and her cousin is at her side to translate. So when you look at her, she looks very malnourished. She looks exhausted. She's thin. When she's asked for her ID so that she can get the services, her cousin pulls it out of his wallet. So you're thinking that her cousin is very supportive. Her cousin is probably helping her out because she doesn't know the language. But then she says that she works for her cousin at the convenience store, and there is more to the story. So she was forced to do domestic work at her cousin's home all day. She was forced to work at the corner store at night. She was not paid for any of her work. She was denied education. She was not able to contact her family. And recently, what her cousin started doing was locking her at the convenience store at night and having male customers come in, where she would be forced to have sex with up to 5 customers per night. So there are a lot of red flags in this situation, including indicators of control and including red flags for sex and labor trafficking. So when you think about Safra's example, you'll notice that her cousin is a domineering, accompanying individual. And a lot of these victims may be accompanied by the trafficker or a person who's working for the trafficker. She's very fearful. She's very hypervigilant. She has this scripted and consistent history. And then you'll also notice that she doesn't know her address. She doesn't really have a lot of her possessions. Sometimes these families or these trafficking victims are paying in cash. Sometimes they're wearing a lot more than what you expect for the weather or a lot less. And there's delayed presentation and medical care. This is a similar example. So this is a couple that was sentenced to holding a Nigerian nanny hostage for 2 years. And they had her away from the public's eye. She worked and she wasn't even being paid. She was denied any medical care, and she was being trafficked for 2 years. So then this is the couple in this photo, and they were actually arrested for that as well. So that was the first example. That was Safra. But then we talk about Azul. So Azul is a 17-year-old. He ran away from his home in Lansing, and he ran out of money, so he was sleeping and living on the streets. Then he was introduced by a group of friends to kind of like a group of older men. And what this group of men said is that, they just need some sort of sexual favors. And then instead of the sexual favors, they would actually go ahead and pay him money for that. And then he used that money to buy heroin because he was already on drugs after he was kind of connected with that group of people on the street. And then after a few years, he decides to get tested. So he tests himself for HIV. He presents to an urgent care clinic. And then at the urgent care clinic, whether you're the administrative assistant, whether you're the physician assistant, whether you're the physician, the nurse, whoever you are in Azul's circle or in Azul's connections, you start asking questions because you want to help him. So this is where two myths come into place. The first myth is something that people kind of don't understand a whole lot. So they say, well, if Azul was on the street and if he kind of consented to what he was supposed to be doing, he knew what he was supposed to be doing, he knew how much he was going to be paid, and he knew how much he was going to get. So he really consented to being trafficked. He should have known better. And the thing is that it doesn't matter. So the initial consent to commercial sex or labor setting prior to acts of force, fraud, or coercion doesn't matter. And what's even more important in Azul's case is that he is 17 years old. So he is a child. And even if he were one day younger than his 18th birthday, remember, we do not need to show that he was forced, that he was coerced, or that anything happened to force him into human trafficking, and he would still be a victim. Something else that's also important in Azul's case is that a lot of times we want to help. We want to ask questions because we want to help people. And a lot of us think that victims of human trafficking, they will immediately ask for help. They want us to save them and they want us to help them. But this is not true because they don't trust you. They blame themselves. They may have had specific instructions from the trafficker not to listen to a word that you have to tell them. So that's why it's important to remember that not every victim you identify or you suspect as a victim will feel safe to leave their situation. You just need to let them know that they're safe. You need to equip them with resources, and you need to affirm that they're not criminals. So this is where the concept of empowerment comes along. So you need to empower them versus save them. And that's how we kind of start understanding that there is an impact of trauma on individuals, families, and communities. And because of their exposure to trauma, they kind of react differently to different things. So in this particular situation, in Azul's situation, for example, in similar cases, please don't ask about how much of the money he was allowed to keep. Don't ask him what his boyfriend's name was. Don't ask him specific questions that may not help, that just kind of feed off, curiosity or just kind of like, trying to kind of find out about what happened to him. But maybe ask him, when was the last time you ate? Did anyone physically hurt you? Is there anything else that you feel comfortable telling me about and that I can help you out with? So that's very, very important. So it's really more about empowerment versus saving. So moving to the third piece of the puzzle, and then that's rouge. So rouge is the word red in French, and rouge is a 13-year-old child. She actually presented to the emergency department. So these scenarios are all based on true patients and true stories. I just kind of changed their names and changed a little bit of their story so that I would protect their anonymity. So this is a child, and she presented initially to the emergency department. She had vaginal discharge. She had missed her periods. She stated that she was sexually active with multiple partners, including her 30-year-old boyfriend, and not only him, but also his friends. She had ran away from home, and her boyfriend was giving her a place to stay. So think about this example a little bit more. Think about rouge, and think about, what I have highlighted here on the slide. So age 13 is actually a very, very sensitive age. It's an age where teenagers are so vulnerable. And it's not just 13, it's 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Any teen is very vulnerable to being trafficked. The other thing is that a lot of them present to emergency departments and urgent cares, and they don't really have a medical provider. And they may present with sexually transmitted infections. So whether you're kind of aware of something like that, or whether you're involved and you know that someone was diagnosed with multiple sexually transmitted infections, then that's a red flag. And then she also missed her last 2 periods. So now we're thinking that she's pregnant. But then what's also a huge red flag is that she had ran away from home and she was having sex not only with her boyfriend, but also with multiple partners, and that he was giving her a place to stay in lieu of sex. Again and again, in children, when they are victims of human trafficking, we don't need to show that he forced her to do any of that. We don't need to show that he tricked her or that there was fraud involved. And we don't need to show that there was any coercion. So rouge, because she's a minor, she cannot consent to any commercial sexual act. So when we come to identifying victims of human trafficking, again, we said, we need to identify who's vulnerable. And when we see these children, if they have multiple sexually transmitted infections, if they come in with a lot of previous pregnancies, abortions, if they keep visiting the emergency department, running away behavior is a huge, huge thing, running away from school, a history of sexual abuse and physical abuse, or if they're involved with child protective services or the juvenile justice system. And some of the other indicators may include if they have an inflicted injury, if they have tattoos on their body. So some of these tattoos are used for branding. If the child is withdrawn, if there is any substance misuse, if they have expensive items. We've had children traffic themselves to get an iPad or even to get food for the day. If they have poor dentition or they just kind of lack self-care. So there has been a lot of different questionnaires around the medical providers, and some of them are used in the emergency department, some of them are used in other medical facilities, and this is just one of them. So I'm just going to go over it briefly, just as an example of questionnaire, where we sometimes ask children and we ask adults if they've ever been exposed to drugs or alcohol, running away from home, being involved with law enforcement. So sometimes we do ask about these risk factors. And if they answer yes to any one of this, then we usually ask them if they've ever had sex in exchange for something that they wanted or needed, if someone had asked them to have sex with another person, or someone had taken photos of them. It doesn't mean that if any one of those questions are yes, then yes, that they're victims of human trafficking, but it means that this is a huge red flag and you really need to kind of identify and you need to report to Child Protective Services in cases of children. So just briefly going over what we do in medical evaluations is that we assess overall their health and nutrition, we treat medical conditions, we obtain the sexual assault evidence kit or the rape kit, we document the injuries that they have, whether it's in their genital area or elsewhere in their body. We offer them testing, we consider treatment and testing and drug testing, and we do what we can. So I don't have to do every single one of these at my clinic. If I can only get away with assessing the overall health and nutrition, then that's fine. If that child wants to come in only for testing and then she kind of refuses all the other physical exam, then that's fine too. So we just kind of do as the patient wishes, and we kind of do it step by step just to make sure that these things are done. This is going back to Rouge, the red piece of the puzzle, and showing you that on her exam, she actually had a normal anogenital examination. She had tattoos on her body, and she also had self-inflicted injury, and she was pregnant. So these are indications of self-harm, and I'm sure that most of you have seen these in children. Again, they don't diagnose human trafficking, but they just show you that this child is needing your help. They could be a victim of bullying. They could be a victim of child abuse. They could be having anxiety at school. It could be anything. But as soon as you see these self-harm behaviors or these self-harm injuries, then please notice that this child needs more help. Also tattoos, especially if they have someone's name, if they have dollar signs, if they're on kind of weird places and weird parts of the body, then that also is another kind of red flag telling us that, pay a little bit more attention to this child or adults and kind of see what's going on. So something that we need to unlearn from this example is that a normal examination does not rule out sexual abuse, and it does not rule out human trafficking either. So I think everybody's anticipating that because Rouge is pregnant and because Rouge has been trafficked by so many different people, because she's been sexually exploited for months and months, that she would have a positive exam or she would have some sort of injury on her anogenital examination. But this could not be further from the truth. So it's normal to be normal, and only a small percentage of children have any signs of genital or anal injury upon examination. And it could be because no injury happened because of the nature of the contact. It could be because these tissues stretched because she's a teenager, so no injury happened. And it could be because I'm examining her weeks maybe or months maybe after what happened, so that injury has healed at this point in presentation. So normal does not mean nothing happened, and normal does not mean sexual abuse didn't happen. A normal exam doesn't mean that pregnancy doesn't happen, and it doesn't mean that human trafficking didn't happen either. So what we do next is that you have to kind of figure out in your setting, at your workplace, or within your community, what do you have? What existing protocols do you have? What do you need to do? How do you contact Child Protective Services? Do you have any organizations, any shelters, anything in your community? And then the number for the National Human Trafficking Hotline is actually really, really important. So I think it's something that you don't need to memorize, but you need to at least be able to Google it or look it up whenever you need to. And remember that you are a mandated reporter depending on what you do. So maybe you are mandated by law, and maybe you're not mandated by law, but you're trying to do something to help your community. And remember that every child victim needs to be offered a medical exam. So that could be the route of how children are referred. So when do we examine children? And this is something that I'm just putting out there so that you know that if you know about a member of your community who has been sexually assaulted, and the sexual assault happened within 120 hours in the state of Michigan, remember that you need to have that child or that adult, male, female, adult, child. The law in Michigan is 120 hours. And if human trafficking or sexual assault or abuse happened within 120 hours, please refer that child to a place within your community that is able to do a rape kit or forensic evidence collection kit. If it happened more than 120 hours and the child is stable, please kind of figure out in your community what you need to do and where these exams take place. So I can tell you in Wayne County, they happen at our clinic at the Children's Advocacy Center, but every county is different. So remember this rule, remember the 120 hours or the 5 days. So less than 5 days, a rape kit is offered, needed, the child or the adult is referred for that. More than 5 days, please figure out where these examinations are done. And also figure out kind of gently, like you don't need to offer all of these services all at once, but you just need to kind of keep them in mind that there are so many services that these children and adults need, including housing, interpreter services, emotional support, mental health, legal advocacy, and case management as well. So going back to our cases, this is the last case. So this is Green. And this is a case that we saw during COVID. So Green was a 14-year-old child, and she accepted a friend's request on Facebook, kind of texting back and forth using her school laptop. He asked her for her photo. He said he was in love with her. And then she started sending these photos. Some of them were nude. And then he wanted to meet her because he was really in love with her and he wanted to see her. So she goes to a hotel where he meets her there, but then he sexually assaults her with a group of men. She runs away from the motel and then she seeks help. So this is a form of sex trafficking and exploitation, which is called online. So online includes a lot of grooming, a lot of online solicitation. It also includes a lot of child sexual abuse material that is transmitted back and forth between this child and the trafficker, or between the adult and the trafficker as well. And this is something that's very, very important. We ask about it all the time. And sometimes in these cases, they tend to be prosecuted a little bit more quickly than other cases because there's some sort of evidence of the back and forth of the photos. But these cases are very, very important. And we start thinking about these children and we start thinking about how do we talk to parents? So think about where you are in terms of your work, in terms of what you do in your community, and think about these children that spend more and more time on the internet. They become a little bit more secretive about the use of technology. They become more possessive of their phone. They kind of talk about this person or new friend, and they start leaving home for periods without explanation. So the impact of COVID has been kind of studied. So we still don't know the full impact of COVID, but we have to realize that social distancing and closed borders and job losses, and then more time spent online, it actually intensified the drivers and the root causes for human trafficking. And it did increase the likelihood of abuse, of child labor, of online grooming and exploitation, and domestic trafficking for sexual and labor exploitation as well. So when we respond to trafficking, we keep asking ourselves the same question: who is vulnerable? Who is more likely to be trafficked? And we think about Green, we think about Safra, we think about Azul, and we think about Rouge. And we think about the individual risk factors, the relationship, the community, and the society. And that's how you can kind of figure out what you can do. So on an individual level, you can kind of focus on education. Maybe addressing the adverse childhood experiences, maybe addressing child maltreatment prevention. What about on a relationship level? You can start working on a team-based prevention, on mentoring programs. How about if you mentor someone who's younger or someone who is more junior than you are? What about peer-to-peer education, which is pretty much what we're doing right now, is that we're sitting together and we're educating each other. What about us as a community? Maybe you can connect with financial resources. Maybe you can work on housing opportunities. What about organizational policies and legislation development and multidisciplinary partnership, which again is what's happening right now? What about us as a society? Maybe we need to start rethinking about our social cultural norms, about social inequity, about social determinants of health. So there's always something that we can do. And not all of us, or not one of us, can do every single thing that I talked about. So you need to pick and choose. So I've talked to you about all these 4 examples, but then this is the last myth that I'm going to leave you with, is that, I've talked about these puzzle pieces, and sometimes we think that we're going to get this kind of set of puzzle that is in a box together, and maybe each one of us is kind of living in their own world or their own box. But this is how we see people, and this is how you see people all around you, is that you see kind of different people, and how are you going to pick and choose which one is vulnerable or which one is at risk for being trafficked? So that's why you start thinking about these examples, and maybe you'll start thinking about Azul, and you'll be able to better identify. So maybe after today's talk, you're more likely to identify that both male and female victims could be victims of human trafficking. Maybe to look more carefully for red flags. Maybe that evaluations could be challenging and that you're really focused on empowerment versus rescuing. Maybe you'll think of Safra's example and you'll start recognizing pregnant victims of human trafficking. Maybe you'll start kind of noticing self-harms and tattoos, and maybe referring patients or referring victims. Maybe you'll start kind of thinking that you're a mandated reporter, and you're always going to obtain professional help. So think about what you do, and think about people not speaking English. Are you going to get a professional interpreter, or are you going to have the cousin or somebody else with them interpret for them? What about when you think about Ruda's example? Maybe you'll connect with a children's advocacy center in your county. So maybe you'll just kind of go ahead and Google and find out which county you're in, and then Google and find out where is the children's advocacy center in my county. And then you're going to connect with services over there. Maybe you're just going to advocate and educate professionals, or just kind of, spread the word of what we've been talking about. So it's very, very hard to sometimes diagnose, and sometimes to recognize that someone is a victim or is vulnerable to be trafficked. So that's why I keep saying that let's focus on identifying risk factors, and let's work on that, and let's work on prevention versus waiting till a child goes through all of that and until they're trafficked. So I always talk about puzzles, and I'm actually a puzzle person myself. So this is a photo that my daughter took when we were at Chicago's airport, and we found this piece of the puzzle literally on the airport floor. No one had paid attention to it. Nobody was all excited about it other than my daughter and I, because we love puzzles. And we were looking at it and we're like, we wonder who lost that piece, and we wonder where that piece is from. And we wonder, who's it's from. So anyways, so this is just to kind of show you that sometimes, when you are looking for something, and when you're more in tuned to think of something, you're more likely to see it, like pieces of the puzzle, for example. And I can tell you that, sometimes we think of piece of the puzzle and we think of it as an edge piece, but this is actually a round puzzle that my daughter and I had assembled together. And this is what it looked like at the end. So just to kind of show you that even when we do see an edge piece of the puzzle, it doesn't mean that all puzzles have edges. So puzzles are different. Children are different. Adults are different. And you really need to listen to survivors, and you need to kind of figure out what you in your capacity can do. So this is from the Polaris website, and I just have little screenshots here to show you different examples. So they have this on the Polaris website. It talks about listening to survivors. They even have these sheets that you can download in different languages, and you can just kind of put all over the place. If you want to put it, for example, in a public restroom, if you want to put it at your place of work. They also have different ways of how you can help, including education. They have the National Human Trafficking Resource Hotline. And then I also have several suggested readings if you're interested in that. But I do thank you for inviting me, and I thank you for taking the time to listen about this presentation regarding human trafficking. And I would love to take any questions or any suggestions or any points of discussion that you may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nazer. And I also would like to add, because I am a mandated reporter, I do work for the state of Michigan, Department of Health and Human Services. I did put in the chat that if anyone does know of any child abuse, any instances of child abuse and neglect, I did put in the chat to contact the state of Michigan centralized intake. I did put that number in the chat. It is a statewide number where you can report any instances of child abuse and neglect, and they will take your complaint 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They take no days off.
Thank you for doing that. Yes, please, this is a mandated reporter hotline, but please call for any suspicion. You don't need to diagnose, you just need to suspect. So if you
Yes.
suspect anything, you can just go ahead and report.
And also it is important to note as well that you can remain anonymous. You do not have to provide your name, your name as well. So I always encourage individuals, we do, and just within our community, and myself, as a mandated reporter, I see that just in my job on a daily basis, and I'm actually working with an individual now that was sex trafficked. She's a young lady from Honduras, and she was sex trafficked by her parents. She was 13. She was sold to a man who was 30. She got pregnant. So I do understand that peril that she was involved in, and now she's in the United States seeking a better life. So it is, these services are definitely needed for individuals if they make it out. So it definitely, so I was very excited when we were hosting this forum, and I'm very, very excited for that. So I very much appreciate your information that you brought to your
Thank you.
presentation. Very, very good information.
Thank you.
And we can open it up if anyone has any other questions.
I don't have a question. I would just like to thank you for this presentation, as it was very informative and very eye-opening as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for attending and for your kind words, everyone, including the comments in the chat. Thank you.
So if we do not have any other questions or comments, we will have our presentation and closing remarks, and also our closing prayer.
Okay. Thank you again, Dr. Nazer. It was so interesting to find out that we can learn and unlearn and relearn. So thank you so much for sharing that information. At this time, we would like to share our appreciation for your presentation, and I will read it at this time. Grand Rapids Negro Business and Professional Women's Certificate of Appreciation. This certificate is awarded to Dr. Dena Nazer in appreciation for presenting working together as partners of excellence for better identification and prevention of human trafficking. Presented during Human Trafficking Month for the Grand Rapids Negro Business and Professional Women's Club on January 14th, 2023. Mary Thompson, President. Thank you so much. This was very, very informative and enjoyable.
I'm honored. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you again. And we will have our closing prayer.
All right, ladies, before I close us out in prayer, I would like everyone to unmute themselves, and let's give Dr. Nazer a round of applause, please.
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much.
Dr. Nazer, thank you. Job well done. Well done. I watched this presentation this fall, so you came to mind for sure. I love you, different things that you present, and I'll talk to my club sisters about it later, and how you do presentations with Wayne State, and they can go online and register for those. And I love your presentations because you make it real. You make it, for everybody to understand. So I thank you and I appreciate you for that.
Thank you. Thank you, for spending a Saturday afternoon with me talking about this. So thank you. I'm honored, and thank you so much for doing that, for inviting me as well.
And I'm an alumni of Wayne State as well, so that made it even more special.
Awesome.
Well, ladies, this has been a wonderful, wonderful session.
Yes, it has.
We all know we have work to do. So I just want to, in closing, say, Father God, I just thank you. Thank you for the presentation, the facts, the statistics, everything that was presented to us today, Lord. Let us go out, pick up the torch, do something. Something is better than nothing, Lord. Lord, let us, as we go out today and the sun is still shining, let us go out and enjoy, be safe. Thank you. In the name of Jesus, thank you.
Thank you, audience, for your attendance. Thank you, club sisters, for taking time out this afternoon to garner this information. It's something that's happening in Grand Rapids, so we need to be cognizant of what we see, hear, and do. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Henrietta, for joining us today. I see Henrietta Colmers from the Lansing Club is
Thank
with
you,
us.
Henrietta.
Thank you. It was a
Thank
joy
you.
to participate. And as I was thinking about it, this should be shared with the whole North Central District.
I was thinking that too, Henrietta. It's such valuable information.
It
Yes,
is.
it is.
It is.
Yes, it is.
absolutely.
Yes.
Yes.
Even
Thank you,
pass
Annette,
it
for
to up
coming.
to the national office as well.
Mhm.
I agree.
Thank you, ladies.
welcome.
you.
Have a good
Thank
evening.
you. I see Elena, my friend who has moved to Las Vegas, she's on.
Oh,
Thank
wow.
you, Elena, for
Fantastic.
joining us.
We also have Annette with us. Annette is
Yes.
looking at our group and coming in as a new sister. So welcome. Thanks
Oh,
for joining
okay.
us.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome.